The United States today exhibits characteristics of Stage 5, bad financial conditions and intense conflict in both major theories of empire decline. This places America in the same pattern that preceded the fall of Spain, Britain's loss of dominance, and the USSR's 1991 collapse, though the US retains formidable technological advantages that could alter its trajectory. The evidence shows empires follow remarkably consistent patterns: rapid rise through innovation or resource exploitation, peak dominance lasting decades, stagnation as wealth breeds complacency, and eventual collapse, when debt, inequality, and internal division overwhelm the system. Two theories explain this pattern. Sir John Glubb's 1976 analysis documented how 11 empires across 3,000 years each lasted approximately 250 years, moving through 7 predictable stages. Ray Dalio's 2020 to 2021 work quantified the pattern using 500 years of economic data, identifying 6 stages in what he calls the Big Cycle. Both converge on a troubling conclusion. Late-stage decline markers, unsustainable debt, extreme inequality, political dysfunction, and loss of manufacturing now characterize the dominant Western powers. The theoretical frameworks that predict collapse, Sir John Bagot Glubb, British general, military historian, commander of Jordan's Arab Legion, published his 7-stage theory in 1976, after studying empires from Assyria, 859 BC, through modern Britain. His key insight: despite vast differences in technology, geography, and political systems, empires consistently lasted approximately 250 years, 10 generations, before collapsing. Glubb's 7 stages begin with the Age of Pioneers, when a relatively unknown people bursts onto the world stage with extraordinary courage and reckless initiative. Poor but hardy, they overcome every obstacle through sheer energy and fearlessness. This transforms into the Age of Conquests, as military expansion becomes organized and professional, adopting sophisticated weapons while maintaining daring initiative. Success breeds the Age of Commerce. Vast territories under unified government automatically stimulate trade, and merchants exchange goods across considerable distances. This period, Glubb's High Noon produces splendid architecture, art, and infrastructure. Military glory remains honoured, but wealth accumulation begins replacing honour as the primary objective. The 4th stage, the Age of Affluence, marks the crucial turn. Immense wealth transforms national character as money replaces honour and adventure in young men's ambitions. Schools abandon producing brave patriots in favour of credentials commanding high salaries. Service to country yields to personal gain. The voice of duty falls silent. The Age of Intellect follows. As great wealth enables pursuit of knowledge, universities multiply, natural science advances remarkably, and academic honours replace both wealth and adventure as young people's goals. But this produces a fatal weakness. Endless discussion destroys power of action, as intellectuals believe human reason can solve all problems without self-sacrifice. Stage 6, the Age of Decadence, shows multiple symptoms simultaneously. Nations become defensive, building great walls and replacing weapons with subsidies. Universal pessimism pervades society. Materialism and cynicism replace religious faith. A "let us eat, drink, and be merry" mentality dominates. Foreigners flood capital cities, welfare states provide generous assistance, civil divisions intensify rather than unity emerging against threats. Heroes become athletes and entertainers rather than statesmen or generals. Sexual morality declines. The Age of Decline and Collapse, Stage 7, follows inevitably, though its form varies depending on external circumstances. Ray Dalio's 2020 to 2021 framework approaches the same pattern through quantitative analysis. As founder of the world's largest hedge fund, Dalio studied 500+ years of economic data across all major reserve currency empires, the Dutch, British, and American, plus 6 other significant powers including China, back to the Tang dynasty. His methodology relies on an 18-factor health index measuring everything from education to military strength to debt levels. Dalio's 6 stages begin with the New Order, when new power structures emerge following upheaval, featuring low debt, small wealth gaps, and people working together effectively. Resource allocation and building follows, with increased productivity, innovation, and rising share of world trade. Peace and prosperity marks the top high points across all 8 key measures of power, with sustained economic growth and broad-based prosperity. But prosperity enables the period of excesses. High debt accumulates, large wealth gaps emerge, education and infrastructure quality decline, and internal class conflicts develop. Growing external rivals challenge the overextended empire. This creates the groundwork for Stage 5, crisis and conflict. Worsening financial conditions, large wealth gaps triggering resentment, economic shocks, rising populism, declining institutional trust, and intense political polarization characterize this stage. Dalio assesses the United States is currently here, with 60–80% probability of severe internal conflict in the next 5 years, if trends continue. The final stage, civil war or revolution, occurs if Stage 5 conditions worsen sufficiently. Open warfare, extreme violence, and potential societal collapse follow, eventually establishing new internal and external orders, returning to Stage 1. Not all declines reach this point. Some resolve through non-violent revolutions like the US and UK in the 1930s, when wealth redistribution followed by World War II, unity averted civil war. Both theories identify the same core mechanisms. Excessive wealth and prolonged power corrupt, shifting values from duty and courage to selfishness and materialism. Debt accumulates as empires overextend militarily. Wealth gaps widen until resentment destroys social cohesion. Intellectualism replaces action. Foreigners flood in as native populations become soft. The pattern appears nearly impossible to prevent. Glubb questioned whether any nation had ever avoided it. Spain's 250-year cycle from silver to bankruptcy. Spain's trajectory from 1492 to 1700 exemplifies the pattern with devastating clarity. The Age of Pioneers began with Columbus's 1492 voyage and the conquistador era. Between 1519 to 1521, Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire. By 1532 to 1533, Francisco Pizarro had taken the Inca realm. The 1545 discovery of the Potosi silver mines in Peru, plus rich Mexican deposits in Zacatecas and Guanajuato, transformed Spain into Europe's dominant power. The Age of Commerce and peak dominance arrived in the mid-16th century. Silver imports reached 210 million pesos during the 16th century alone, approximately 3,915 metric tons of pure silver. Spain controlled the largest economy on the European continent by the 1550s. At peak, Potosi produced nearly 60% of the world's silver output. By 1590, Spanish GDP per capita stood 40% higher than it would have been without American treasure. Philip II incorporated Portugal and its colonies in 1580, expanding the empire to its maximum territorial extent. The pound sterling would later be pegged at rates reflecting Spanish silver's dominance of global currency. But the age of affluence brought catastrophic consequences. The massive silver influx triggered what historians call the price revolution. Prices rose sixfold between 1520 and 1640. Annual inflation of 1 to 1.5% sounds modest today, but devastated a specie-based monetary system. More critically, the resource curse destroyed Spain's competitive industries. The real exchange rate appreciated dramatically, making Spanish exports uncompetitive while imports became cheaper. Toledo's famous steel industry vanished. Wool exports collapsed from 400,000 sacks annually to just 25,000. Textile, glass, and manufacturing industries all but disappeared by 1650. The serial bankruptcies document the decline precisely. Philip II declared bankruptcy in 1557, just 1 year after inheriting the throne. Then again in 1560, 1575, and 1596. By his death in 1596, total debt reached 85.5 million ducats against annual income of only 9.7 million, a debt-to-income ratio of 9 to 1. Philip III declared bankruptcy in 1607. Philip IV in 1627, 1647, 1656, and 1662. 9 bankruptcies in a century. Taxes increased 430% under Philip II, while average wages rose only 80%. Interest rates grew from 17% to 48%. Eventually, no banker in Europe would lend to Spanish Habsburg kings. The human cost was staggering. Population fell from over 8 million in 1598 to under 7 million by the 1650s. The 1,609 expulsion of the Moriscos removed crucial agricultural workers. Plague killed at least 1.25 million during the 17th century, including 25% of Seville's population between 1,647 to 1,652. Spain's urban network collapsed. The nation that had 4 cities over 100,000 before 1492, Seville, Granada, Toledo, Córdoba didn't achieve a single city of that size again until Madrid reached it in 1750. Military defeats marked the final collapse. The 1,643 Battle of Rocroi destroyed Spain's elite tercios, the traditional marker of the end of Spanish dominance in Europe. The crisis of 1,640 saw simultaneous rebellions in Portugal, which won independence, Catalonia, Andalusia, Naples, and Sicily. The 1,648 Peace of Westphalia forced recognition of Dutch independence after 80 years of war. The 1,659 Treaty of the Pyrenees ratified the end of Spanish hegemony, with France becoming Europe's dominant power. By 1700, exactly 208 years after Columbus's first voyage, Spain had transformed from hegemonic power to financially exhausted, second-rate power. GDP per capita fell to 40% below where it would have been without the silver windfall. The 1,700 death of Charles II, mentally and physically disabled final Habsburg king, triggered the War of Spanish Succession. The 1,713 Treaty of Utrecht stripped Spain of the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, Sicily, Gibraltar, and Minorca. The age of decline was complete. The cause-effect chain is clear. Resource, curse, appreciation, loss of industrial competitiveness, over-reliance on unpredictable silver revenue, chronic budgetary instability, serial bankruptcies, military overextension in endless European wars, debt spiral, institutional collapse, territorial disintegration. Spain spent 250 years declining from first-rank power to backwater. Britain's industrial supremacy and the cost of 2 world wars, Britain's cycle took longer to complete but followed the same pattern. The age of pioneers and conquests spanned the 1,600 to 1,700 as naval power, colonial expansion, and the Industrial Revolution, 1,760 to 1,840, transformed a mid-sized island into the world's wealthiest nation. GDP per capita growth accelerated from 0.13% annually, 1086 to 1700, to 0.48% annually during 1700 to 1870, steam power, mass production, and manufacturing employment reaching 1/3 of the population by 1870 gave Britain crushing competitive advantages. The age of commerce arrived in full force during the 1800s. The 1851 Great Exhibition showcased Britain as the workshop of the world. The nation supplied half of manufactured goods to France, Germany, Belgium, and the United States. By 1870, Britain produced approximately 30% of the world's industrial output and controlled 25% of global trade. The British Empire governed 23% of the world's population by 1922. Real GDP per capita in 1870 stood 1/3 greater than America's and 70% more than France or Germany. The pound sterling's dominance exemplified peak power. By 1900, sterling represented 62% of global foreign exchange reserves, while the dollar held 0%. Over 60% of world trade was invoiced in pounds. London served as the world's centre for insurance, commodity markets, and foreign investment. The gold standard's late 19th century adoption cemented the pound's hegemony. Britain was the leading capital exporter, with net property income from abroad reaching approximately 9% of GDP. But Britain's age of affluence and beginning of decline came abruptly with World War I. The war's direct costs were catastrophic. National debt exploded from £650 million sterling in 1914 to £7.8 billion sterling by 1919. The debt-to-GDP ratio surged from 25% to 143%, eventually peaking at 187.5% in 1922. War spending exceeded 25% of GDP annually during 1915 to 1918. The nation lost 715,000 military dead, 10% of domestic assets, and 24% of overseas assets. The indirect costs proved equally devastating. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1919 with foreign reserves exhausted. Export volume in the mid-1920 reached only 75% of 1,913 levels. Permanent market share losses to America and Japan. Unemployment in staple industries during 1925 to 1929 was severe. Coal mining 16.5%, cotton 13.6%, iron and steel 25.5%, shipbuilding 30.5%. The deflationary period of 1920 to 1923 saw prices fall 30% while real earnings showed no growth. Despite massive primary budget surpluses averaging 7% of GDP during 1921 to 1929, the debt to GDP ratio rose from 1.47 to 1.58. Debt interest consumed 44% of all government expenditure by the mid-1920. Economic historians estimate Britain suffered annual GDP losses of approximately 11% throughout the 1920. America overtook Britain as the world's largest economy in 1916, but the pound's reserve status persisted through inertia. The 1944 Bretton Woods Conference formalized the transition. Meeting July 1–22, 1944, with 44 allied nations, the conference anchored the dollar to gold at $35 per ounce while pegging other currencies to the dollar. The New York Times declared on the 23rd of July 1944, "The American dollar thus obtains international recognition, on paper as in fact, as the world currency." Britain's negotiating position was weak. In many respects, Bretton Woods was a rout for Keynes and the British. World War II delivered the coup de grace. Defense spending reached 50% of GDP in 1944 to 45. National debt peaked at 249% of GDP in 1945 to 46, the all-time high. Britain had sacrificed over 1/4 of its national wealth. The 1947 independence of India removed the jewel in the crown. Decolonization swept through Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean over the following decades, ending the economic benefits of empire by the 1960s. The post-war period brought inexorable relative decline. Sterling's share of global reserves fell from 55% in the 1950s to 45% by 1970, and just 4.7% by 2020, while the dollar rose from 30% in 1950 to 70% by the mid-1960s. Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973, shifting trade ties from empire to Europe. Deindustrialization accelerated. Manufacturing employment peaked at 8.9 million, 30% of the workforce, in 1966, but collapsed to 2.7 million, 7.7%, by 2019, a 70% loss of 6.2 million jobs. The early 1980 recession under Thatcher and the early 1990 downturn eliminated millions more positions. Britain's manufacturing performance during 1973 to 1992 was catastrophic. Output increased only 1.3%, while Japan grew 68.9%, Italy 68.6%, the US 55.2%, West Germany 32.1%, and France 16.5% in the same period. The nation's share of world manufacturing output collapsed from 22.9% at the 1870 peak to 13.6% by 1913, then 4.9% by 1973. Britain, that had once supplied half the world's manufactured goods, could barely maintain output as the global economy expanded. The financial sector replaced manufacturing as the economy's centre. Services became dominant, with London's financial district, technology companies, and consulting firms driving growth, but this benefited the southeast disproportionately. A stark north-south divide emerged, with former industrial heartlands in permanent relative decline. Recent crises multiplied. The 2008 financial crisis required £137 billion in bank bailouts. Brexit in 2016 sent the pound to $1.29. COVID-19 disrupted the economy, and by 2022, debt had climbed back to 100.1% of GDP. Britain's cycle ran approximately 250 years from 1,700 to 1,950, as Glubb calculated, with absolute decline continuing through the present. The pattern: technological first-mover advantage, industrial dominance, financial centre status, overextension in WWI, loss of gold standard, interwar stagnation, World War II devastation, loss of empire, loss of reserve currency, deindustrialization, permanent relative decline. The pound that was 62% of global reserves in 1900 represents less than 5% today. The Soviet Union's asymmetric rise and rapid disintegration. The USSR presents a compressed version of the pattern, completing the cycle in approximately 70 years, rather than 250 faster, because the centrally planned system generated internal contradictions more rapidly than market economies. Stalin's industrialization between 1928 to 1940 constituted the Age of Pioneers. From an 82% rural, agriculture-dominated economy with GDP per capita around $300, $1,964, the USSR transformed into a major industrial power through sheer force. Industrial production grew extraordinarily during the 1930s, while the capitalist world suffered the Great Depression. GNP grew 5.7% annually, despite massive disruption. Industrial output share of the economy surged from 39.5% in 1928 to 68.8% by 1950. The human cost was genocidal, the 1,932 to 1,933. Soviet famine killed 5.7 to 8.7 million people as forced collectivization extracted agricultural surplus to fund industrialization. The age of conquest came through military victory in World War II. Though GDP fell 34% between 1940 to 1942 during the German invasion, the Red Army's triumph and subsequent expansion into Eastern Europe established the USSR as one of two global superpowers by 1950. Soviet GDP reached $510 billion, $1,990 in 1950, 35% of US size. By 1965, Soviet GDP had grown 198% from 1,950 levels versus America's 179%, showing faster growth rates during this period. Peak power arrived during the 1950 to 1960, the Soviet Union's age of commerce and zenith. GNP growth hit 5.7% annually during 1950 to 1960 and continued strong through the 1960. Per capita, GDP growth reached 3.6% annually, 1,950 to 1,973. Labour productivity grew 2.7% annually, industrial growth 6.5% annually. By 1975, Soviet GNP per capita reached 52% of US levels, maximum convergence. The Soviet economy was estimated at 60% the size of America's by 1970, and remained the world's second largest until the mid-1980. The space program demonstrated peak Soviet power most dramatically, the 4th of October 1957. Sputnik 1 launched the world's first artificial satellite, weighing 184 pounds versus America's planned 3.5-pound satellite. This created the Sputnik crisis and Pearl Harbor effect on American public opinion. The 3rd of November 1957, Sputnik 2 carried dog Laika to orbit. The 12th of April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, completing a full orbit in 1 hour 48 minutes, a crushing blow to NASA. The USSR achieved the first spacewalk, 1965. First spacecraft to impact the moon, first to orbit the moon, and first soft landing with lunar 91966. Providing the first images from the moon's surface. Soviet rocket technology implied capability to deliver nuclear weapons anywhere, prompting NASA's creation on the 29th of July 1958 and Kennedy's 1961 commitment to the moon landing. But stagnation began in the 1970s, the period of excess and beginning of crisis. Growth rates collapsed from 5.7% in the 1950s to 3.4% during 1970, 4 to 1978, then 2.1% during 1979 to 1985. Per capita GDP growth plummeted from 3.6%, 1,950 to 1,973, to just 0.93% annually, 1,974 to 1,984. Gorbachev coined the term era of stagnation for the 1964 to 1982 Brezhnev period, though most scholars mark 1975 as the starting year. The productivity collapse was total from 1970 onward total factor productivity completely stagnated or even retreated. During 1979 to 1985, total factor productivity fell 1% annually, while capital productivity dropped 4.1% annually. Growth came solely from capital accumulation, throwing more inputs into a system with declining efficiency. The average age of equipment increased from 8.3 years in 1970 to 10.3 years in 1989, as the capital stock aged without productivity gains. Oil dependency created fatal vulnerability. As world oil prices quadrupled during 1973 to 74 and rose again in 1979 to 81, oil and gas became the chief driver of the Soviet economy. By 1981, over half of Soviet exports were oil and gas. Raw material share of total exports surged from 26% in 1970 to over 50% by 1980. Premier Kosygin reportedly said, "Things are bad with bread. Give me 3 million tons over the plan." When oil prices crashed in 1986 to $20 per barrel from the 1,979 peak of $70, a drop of over 40%, Soviet oil revenues collapsed, putting heavy pressure on the economy. Military overspending crushed civilian investment. Defense expenditure grew from under 10% of GNP in the late 1950s to approximately 15–17% by the early 1980s, roughly 3 times the US rate. Russian historian Irina Bystrova estimates the military-industrial complex consumed approximately 25% of GDP in the 1980s and absorbed 75% of research and development plus the best technical personnel. The Afghanistan War, 1979 to 1989, killed approximately 15,000 Soviet soldiers while draining resources. Reagan's 1,980 military buildup forced the USSR to follow, further straining the system. The technological gap widened continuously during the stagnation period. The USSR tried to copy IBM's 360 computer in 1965, but faced enormous difficulties manufacturing chips. By the 1970 to 80, the country fell further and further behind in computerization. Military innovations remained locked in the defense sector with limited spillover to the civilian economy. Average raw materials used stood at 1.6 times greater than America for the same output. Average energy needed was 2.1 times greater. Social indicators showed collapse. Life expectancy declined, unique for a developed nation. Infant mortality rose during the 1970 data was suppressed. Alcoholism became rampant, and medical care quality deteriorated significantly. Food imports cost $152 billion total during 1961 to 1985, making the USSR the world's largest cereal importer despite massive agricultural investment. Corruption became pervasive, data fiddling became common practice during 1975 to 1985, and the black market grew to over 10% of official GDP. Gorbachev's the 11th of March 1985 ascension brought perestroika reforms that accelerated rather than prevented collapse. His May 1985 Leningrad speech publicly admitted slowing of economic development and inadequate living standards, the first Soviet leader to acknowledge reality. Perestroika moved through 3 phases. Rationalization, 1985 to 1986, that failed to increase growth. Reform, 1987 to 1990, including the June 1987 Law on State Enterprise, granting autonomy, and the revolutionary May 1988 Law on Cooperatives, permitting private ownership for the first time since 1928, and transformation 1990 to 1991, when the Communist Party lost control entirely. The economic indicators during Perestroika document catastrophic failure. GDP growth averaged only 1.2% during 1986 to 1990. Per capita, GDP growth crashed to negative 1.3% annually, 1985 to 1991. With 1990 seeing negative 3.1% and 1991 plummeting negative 6.8%. Government revenues collapsed as enterprises retained profits. The state received 51% of enterprise profits in 1986, but only 36% by 1989. even as total profits rose. This created exploding budget deficits, unsupported wage increases, and eventual hyperinflation. Prices rose over 0% in 1992 after controls ended. The final collapse came through external shocks. Soviet oil production began falling in 1989 from overuse of deposits. Official oil exports dropped nearly 50% between 1989 to 1991, creating a hard currency crisis. Foreign net debt tripled from $14.9 billion in 1985 to $45.4 billion in 1991. In early 1991, Western private banks cut all credit lines. Gold and hard currency reserves were exhausted by year's end. Exports fell 33% and imports dropped 44% in 1991 versus 1990. The system became increasingly ungovernable. The August 19 to 21, 1991 failed coup attempt by hardliners fragmented political authority. Republics declared independence throughout September-November. Central Soviet institutions lost all authority. The 25th of December 1991. Gorbachev formally resigned and the USSR officially dissolved, leaving $66 billion in external debt with barely any reserves. The Russian Federation inherited roughly half of Soviet population and all of its economic problems. The USSR's 70-year cycle compressed the pattern. Rapid industrialization through forced extraction, 1928 to 1950, peak growth and convergence with US, 1950 to 1960, stagnation as productivity collapsed and oil dependency grew, 1970 to 1984. Failed reform attempts, 1985 to 1991, rapid disintegration. The asymmetric nature, military superpower, but consumer economy disaster created internal contradictions that made the system more fragile than market economies. Stage 5 crisis lasted only 6 years before transition to Stage 6 collapse. America in Stage 5. The toxic mix of debt, inequality, and division. The United States in 2025 exhibits characteristics Ray Dalio identifies as definitively Stage 5 bad financial conditions combined with intense internal conflict. The evidence is comprehensive across every indicator. Federal debt stands at $36.2 trillion in Q2 2025, representing 119.4% of GDP, the highest ratio except the World War II peak. More alarming, unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare total $163 to $175 trillion over the infinite horizon, $59.8 trillion for Social Security, $103.4 trillion for Medicare, plus another $15 trillion for federal employee and veteran benefits. The Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund will be insolvent by 2036. Social Security's Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund by 2033. Without reform, automatic benefit cuts will occur, events likely to trigger massive social unrest. Interest payments now consume $879.9 billion annually, 13% of all federal expenditures in FY 2024, exceeding spending on Medicare or national defense individually. The average interest rate on federal debt has surged from 1.556% in January 2022 to 3.352% by July 2025. JP Morgan economist David Kelly warns America is going broke slowly. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt will reach 118% of GDP by 2035 and potentially 156% by 2055. Annual deficits average 6.2% of GDP, far above the 3 to 4.5% threshold needed for debt stability. The Penn-Wharton budget model calculates restoring fiscal balance requires 14.6% across the board. Tax increases and spending cuts politically impossible given current dysfunction. Ray Dalio assesses a government debt crisis is likely within the next 3 to 5 years and estimates uncomfortably more than 50% probability of severe internal conflict if trends continue. In an October 2025 NPR interview, he explained, "We're approaching a point where the debt service payments are so large that taking on more debt is a problem. The issue is political because they say that there really is 2 promises that are required politically. You have to give one, if not both. And that is, I promise I will not raise your taxes, and I promise that I will not cut your benefits." This contradiction makes reform nearly impossible. The relative decline versus China is stark. US manufacturing has collapsed from 25% of global output in 2000 to a projected 11% by 2030, while China will reach 45% of global output by 2030, according to the UN Industrial Development Organization, October 2024. China now produces 1.5 times America's manufacturing value added, and invests 42% of GDP in fixed capital versus America's 18%. China leads in 7 of 10 advanced industries, according to the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation's Hamilton Index. The Chinese AI breakthrough with DeepSeek demonstrated technological competitiveness, though the US maintains leads in many areas. Dollar reserve currency status is eroding at an accelerating pace. The dollar's share of global reserves fell to 56.3% in Q2 2025, the lowest since 1994, down from 57.8% in Q1 2025, 66% in Q1 2015, and the 70% plus peaks of earlier decades. At the current pace, analysts project the dollar might fall below 50% within 5 years. Foreign ownership of US treasuries has declined to 30% from a 50% peak. Emerging market central banks have doubled gold holdings to 9% of reserves as they diversify away from dollars. BRICS nations actively pursue de-dollarization strategies. Income inequality stands at Gilded Age levels. The Gini coefficient reached 0.49 4 inches 2024, indicating high inequality. The top 1% control over 20% of all income. The top 20% capture 63%. The bottom 20% receive just 3.1%. The richest 1% average 139 times the income of the bottom 20% in 2021. Black unemployment sits at 7.2% versus white unemployment at 3.7%, July 2025. Such extreme inequality, combined with chronic trade deficits, mediocre infrastructure, C grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers, and education rankings showing the US at 15th globally and 37th in math fuels political polarization. Political dysfunction has reached crisis levels. Congress has failed to pass annual budgets on time for 26 consecutive years. Recurring debt ceiling crises threaten default. Government shutdown threats are routine. Gridlock prevents addressing existential challenges like Social Security and Medicare insolvency because both parties refuse to touch these third rails. Democrats won't cut benefits, Republicans won't raise taxes, and neither will compromise. The political system has become unable to make difficult decisions, even when outcomes are predictable and catastrophic. Military spending follows an unsustainable trajectory. The FY 2025 budget ranges from $850 to $895 billion, depending on inclusions, projected to grow to $965 billion by 2039-11% real growth, and potentially $1.5 trillion by 2035 on current trajectory, according to the Stimson Center. Personnel costs and healthcare consume increases, squeezing modernization. Procurement failures waste billions. The Littoral Combat Ship Program alone wasted $28 billion. Multiple simultaneous theaters, Europe, Indo-Pacific, Middle East, stretch forces thin. This echoes the British and Soviet experience of military overextension draining resources from productive investment. Yet America retains formidable strengths that distinguish it from previous declining powers. The technology sector maintains global leadership. US companies dominate AI with OpenAI, ChatGPT, Google, Gemini, Microsoft, and Meta. California alone hosts 32 of the world's 50 top AI companies and 15.7% of US AI job postings. Nvidia dominates AI chips with 69.8, 5% gross margins. 3 US companies exceeded $3 trillion market capitalization in 2025. Google, Apple, Nvidia. Venture capital remains concentrated in America, with over 50% of global AI divided by ML funding flowing to the Bay Area. The US invests 30.3% of gross fixed capital formation in intellectual property sustaining innovation advantages. Productivity gains in Q2 2025 reached 3.3% growth, non-farm business, averaging 1.8% annualized since Q4 2019 above the previous cycles, 1.5% during 2007 to 2019. The Cleveland Fed estimates a 41% probability of entering a high-growth regime. If AI delivers on its promise, a productivity renaissance could alter trajectories. The US Chamber of Commerce suggests productivity could sustain 3% GDP growth. The Richmond Fed expects trend productivity to increase toward 2.5% by 2030. Absolute economic scale remains imposing. $30.5 trillion GDP in 2025, still the world's largest, 1.59 times bigger than China in nominal terms, though China reaches $40.7 trillion in PPP. Growth tracks 2.8% in 2024 and over 3% in Q4, outperforming most developed economies. Unemployment stands at a relatively low 4.1%. The dollar still represents 56.3% of reserves, far exceeding any alternative euro at approximately 20%, yuan at 2 to 3%, 70% of foreign currency debt is issued in dollars, and 48% of cross-border liabilities remain dollar-denominated. Deep, liquid capital markets are unmatched globally. As the Federal Reserve stated in July 2025, the dollar will likely remain the world's dominant international currency for the foreseeable future. Military capabilities remain the world's most powerful despite sustainability questions. The $895 billion budget exceeds the next several countries combined. Technological superiority exists in most systems. Global force projection capability is unique. Nuclear triad maintenance continues. Modernization programs proceed with B-21 bomber production accelerating, F-15EX and F-35 fighter production ongoing, and Space Force capabilities growing. The critical juncture and 4 possible futures. The synthesis reveals America firmly in Stage 5 of both Glob's and Dalio's frameworks. Founded in 1776, the United States is approximately 249 years old, at the end of the typical 250-year empire lifespan, Glob documented. The nation exhibits Stage 6 decadence characteristics: materialism, celebrity culture, replacing statesmanship, political division, extreme inequality, and weakening sense of civic duty. Dalio's quantitative markers confirm the diagnosis: unsustainable debt, intense internal conflict, declining institutional trust, rising populism, and relative decline versus a rising power. Yet the situation differs from previous empire, collapses in one crucial respect. No previous declining power possessed the technological dynamism of America's innovation ecosystem. Spain's silver boom destroyed rather than built industries. Britain's manufacturing excellence became its competitors through technology transfer. The USSR's military-industrial complex locked innovations away from civilian use. America's tech sector, particularly in artificial intelligence, operates in a globally connected, rapidly iterating environment that could drive productivity gains unlike anything in history. 4 scenarios shape the next decade with rough probabilities based on synthesis of expert assessments. Continued managed decline, 40–50% probability. Slow fiscal deterioration continues without reform. Political dysfunction persists below the violence threshold. Dollar gradually loses reserve status. Relative power versus China declines steadily. Living standards stagnate for the bottom 60% while inequality widens. Trade deficits persist. Infrastructure remains mediocre. Education rankings continue falling. This represents the British path loss of dominance through gradual erosion rather than sudden collapse, managing decline through decades without civil war, but also without arresting the slide. Reform and stabilization, 20–30% probability. Bipartisan breakthrough on fiscal issues emerges, possibly triggered by bond market crisis forcing action. AI delivers productivity renaissance, potentially raising trend growth from 2% to 3% plus through automation and efficiency gains. Manufacturing partially reshores as AI reduces China's labor cost advantages. Political temperature reduces as economic conditions improve. Debt trajectory stabilizes through combination of growth and modest tax increases. This requires both political will, currently absent, and technological deliverance from AI, uncertain but possible. Acute crisis, 20–30% probability. Government debt crisis forces dramatic action as borrowing costs spike and bond markets revolt. Social Security and Medicare automatic cuts in 2033 to 2036 trigger massive social unrest among 70+ million beneficiaries. Dollar rapidly loses reserve status, potentially falling below 40% of reserves within 5 years. Multiple economic shocks, compound recession, financial crisis, trade war escalation, political conflict intensifies toward violence. This represents Dalio's Stage 5 progressing towards Stage 6. Outcome depends on whether moderates separate from extremists to forge compromise, or extremists capture both parties, making resolution impossible. Outright collapse divided by stage 6 less than 10% in next 10 years. Civil war or revolution, government unable to function, dollar ceases to be reserve currency, potential territorial fragmentation. This remains unlikely due to continued absolute strengths. Nuclear weapons, military dominance, geographic advantages, no external imperial challenger capable of invasion, and technological excellence. Spain collapsed because rising powers, France, Britain, defeated it militarily and economically. Britain declined because 2 world wars bankrupted it and America replaced it as hegemon. The USSR imploded because the centrally planned system contained fatal contradictions. America faces no comparable external threat and possesses structural advantages, continental scale, ocean barriers, resource abundance, immigrant-driven demographics that make total collapse improbable within a decade. The critical juncture arrives between 2025 to 2035, 3 to 5 years, until likely debt crisis per Dalio, and multiple economists. 2033, when Social Security faces automatic cuts without reform, affecting 70+ million Americans. 2036, when Medicare faces similar cuts affecting even more. This decade determines whether America follows Britain's managed decline, finds renewal through technological revolution, faces acute crisis requiring forced reform, or descends into the chaos of stage 6. The theoretical frameworks converge. Empires rise through innovation or resource advantages, peak during ages of commerce when wealth creation becomes primary, decline when wealth enables decadence and overextension, and collapse when debt, inequality, and internal division overwhelm the system. Spain, Britain, and the USSR all followed this pattern with remarkable consistency. The United States today exhibits every marker of late-stage decline, unsustainable debt at 119% of GDP, with $163 trillion unfunded liabilities, extreme inequality with the bottom 20% earning 3.1% of income, manufacturing collapse from 25% to 11% of global output, reserve currency erosion from 66% to 56% of reserves, political dysfunction preventing reform, and military overstrettention approaching $1 trillion annually. What remains uncertain is whether American technological dynamism, particularly artificial intelligence, can break the pattern that has held across 3,000 years and 11 major empires. The next 3 to 10 years will determine if the United States becomes the first major power to arrest late-stage decline through innovation-driven productivity gains, or if it joins Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union in confirming that the arc of empires bends inexorably toward collapse once the age of decadence begins.